Good morning, friends. Today we are starting a new series called You Asked For It. And really, we're going to do two parts right now, but we'll probably come back to this throughout the year and as we move forward. So my hope is that you will continue to submit questions or ideas or thoughts that you have that we could discuss in a sermon. So you can do that online, commongrace.church/Yafi. Y-A-F-I, you asked for it. There's a form that you can share your thoughts or your questions, and I would love for you to do that. We've already seen some categories begin to emerge from them, and so like this morning, we're going to talk about calling. We'll talk about Bible next week, and you may ask what it means to be a Methodist, practical questions about the faith, geographical questions. I got some of those. Whatever it is, and if this message brings up questions for you, I hope that you'll share them with us. And if they come to you in the middle of the night, you can share them. If you have them as we go along, you can drop them in there anytime you want. And here's the deal. There's no expiration date on that. So you can do that in the next week, or you can do that if it occurs to you in a couple of months. Again, I think we'll come back to this as we go throughout the year. So any thoughts or questions you have, I would love for you to share them with us in that way. And I think it's going to make our conversation richer as we move forward. So like I said, the subject for this morning is about calling. And the two questions that we're discussing this morning that were submitted are this. First, how should we be patient when God's calling isn't clear? And secondly, how do I avoid comparing my calling to someone else's? And then they say size, scale, etc. And so calling is a conversation for the week. And I thought myself into a knot about this. I can do that sometimes. I sort of overthink things or spend too much time and I confuse myself. And when I got to that point where I was thoroughly confused, I called Ashley Allie Crawford, who's a mentor and a friend. I've known her for almost a decade. She's a pastor who works with the Great Plains Conference, and I so much appreciate her. And in my life, she is the guru of call. She has thought more about this than anybody that I know. And so calling her and saying, hey, calling on the phone and asking about calling in life, can you help direct me, was just such a gift. And I want to give credit to her. If we ever do a full series on calling, I want to bring her to come and talk to you all. I think she's just brilliant. She's been such a gift in my life, and she had so much good stuff to share. And so I'm indebted to her for this conversation. As we begin this, I want us to start by looking at Ephesians 4. And if you're following along, we're going to go through a few different scriptures, so you can pause or you can pull that up in your Bible. We're going to read Ephesians 1, 4 through 8. Right now, we'll be in Hebrews a little bit later and in John as well. But I want you to hear these words. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, this is Paul speaking, who's literally a prisoner. He's in jail. He said, I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. But each of us was given grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. That's why it said, when he ascended on high, he made captivity itself a captive. He gave gifts to his people. So that's our first reading. And I want to say something that seventh verse, if you're following along, but each of us was given grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. That's from the NRSV, which is the version that I usually read. Here's two other versions. The NIV says, but to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. Another version says, however, he has given to each one of us a special gift through the generosity of Christ. In essence, what he's saying, if you notice, is there's two parts to this. And this is what we're going to unpack. There is first the one calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one Spirit, to which we are all called and that we share together. But each of us has been given grace according to the measure of Christ's gift, or we've been given special gifts through the generosity of Christ, or Christ has apportioned particular things to each one of us. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. I want to talk about what calling is in context of that. And maybe this idea of calling is new to you. Maybe you're familiar with it, but maybe not comfortable with it. Maybe talking about it, you've heard it in churchy circles or things like that, but you've never really known exactly what it means. Or maybe you do know and you've tried to avoid it because it feels very mystical and and a little bit ethereal, and it's not exactly something that you really feel entirely comfortable with. It's a word that brings a lot of baggage with it. And if you're in that place, that's okay. Or if it's brand new to you, that's okay. But I want to tell you what I understand calling to be really by looking at it at two levels. First of all, you have this primary level. You could call it a common or a general level of calling. It's something that every single person who calls themselves a follower of Christ, all who have been called by God, that all of us share. And that language of primary calling, that's Os Guinness uses that language. So it's shared, it's universal, it's consistent, it's the same. It's held in common for all followers of Jesus. And so all of us share this primary calling to become more like Jesus, to live a righteous and upright life, to help others foster a relationship with God and to encounter grace, to serve and love our neighbors, to act justly, to grow in greater relationship with God, to do the work of discipleship, to worship, to be gathered in community. There are these fundamental elements of what it means to be a follower of Christ, and each and every one of us shares that. There is that general calling or that primary calling that all of us have that's exactly the same. And I want to be clear, it's primary, it's first, it's foundational. That may not be the first thing that we think of when we hear the idea of calling, and I think that's part of where we get ourselves twisted up. That's where it begins, though. We all share this same calling, and that's the first and foundational step. And we won't get deeper, and we won't do better at sort of a secondary calling until we get that piece set in stone, or at least clear in our minds. So this secondary calling, or a specific calling, is more about what that primary calling looks like in our specific context in a specific time. And so my pastor friend Ashley that I mentioned earlier, she says it this way: the secondary calling comes for a reason, for a season, or for a lifetime. And so it's sort of the manifestation. What does that look like in my life, in my context, with my gifts, with my experience, where I am right now? How does that call take its form or its shape? It's going to evolve with us over time. It's not going to look the same through our entire lives. It may be about the place that you invest time and energy right now. And that could be a place of employment. That could be at home. That could be in a community organization. It often has to do with the passions that we have within us, the things that get us really fired up, and how it is that we respond to the needs in the world that exist around us. So oftentimes when we think about this secondary calling, we sometimes think about that as a place of employment, how we live the vocation that we do, the job that we do, how we make our money. And that can be it, but that's not always going to be it. It's the specific manifestation, how it is that we live our call out day to day, understanding that call is first and primarily about Jesus' life with us and our life with Jesus and becoming more like Him. If you notice in our scripture, we see that. We all have this one same shared calling, but Christ has given us each individual gifts with which we are to serve God's world. And so let me give you an example of what this plays out, how this plays out in real life. At a church that I served previously, there was a gentleman that I was pretty close to, and he's a couple generations older than I am. But he told me early on when I got to know him that a part of his calling, what we would call the secondary calling, was to make money to help support ministries of the church and in the community. And he said, just simply put, I'm really good at making money. He was a C-suite executive. He did well with investments and money, and he used that to make a difference in the community around him. So he invested in the church, he invested in community organizations, and he and his partner were incredibly generous people. They did that in financial ways, but they also did that in their spirit. They were incredibly gracious and open and kind, and they supported these local nonprofits. Well, he abruptly quit his job close to the holidays. And I learned about this because he mentioned that they might have to change some of the things that they'd planned for the church, the gifts that they had planned to give and all that. And I asked him about it, and he said that he'd been pressed to sort of fudge some numbers to be not quite truthful in some year-end reports, and he was unwilling to do it. And when he came to an impasse with his supervisors because he wouldn't do that, he walked. And so his partner would later tell me that in so doing, he walked away from a pretty significant bonus that was due to him at the end of the year that they had sort of made plans to support ministries with. And I wondered a bit if that was there was some conflict there, because that's a part of what he was called to. We were having a conversation about that, and he said, no, because I can't be a person of integrity and also have done what they asked me to do. And so for him, it was very clear that if he didn't get that first part, if he didn't get the life like Jesus, being a disciple, following in Jesus' steps, being honest and forthcoming and telling the truth, if he didn't get that right, then he couldn't do the second part right either. He couldn't do the specifics of what he'd been called to do, how he was able to gift the world. And so he walked away. And he said, of course, it's difficult to walk away from that and to give that up. And he didn't have a plan of what to do next. But he knew that if he couldn't do the primary call correctly, that it wasn't going to be fulfilling or right to do the secondary call. And so it's with that context and with that understanding of calling that I want to move into the questions that we have for this morning. The first question, how should we be patient when God's calling isn't clear? You asked for it, so here we go. In my life, personally, and in the ministry that I've done, most of the times when I hear these questions or encounter these questions about being patient, understanding a calling, what we're really talking about is that second one. I want to know where my life is supposed to go, what direction it's supposed to take, what job I'm supposed to have, how I'm supposed to serve the community. I want to know what that looks like. I want to know the specific manifestations of that. That's where we get caught up, and that's where we get impatient. And so we agonize over these questions about how we do that secondary calling and what that looks like. And friends, I can't give you 3 quick steps to discern the answer to all your life's problems or the secondary calling for your life. But generally, I would almost always counsel people to start by focusing on the first. You can't figure out the second. Most of us could be spending a lot more time and energy doing those things that are just simple, basic, being a closer follower of Jesus, learning to listen to his voice, spending time in spiritual practices and prayer, following after Jesus more closely and trying to introduce Jesus to others, looking for ways to act for justice around us right where we are. I would invite us first to focus more on that piece, put more energy in that when we're finding frustration or feel like we're turning our wheels on the second. Because I found that in my life and in other people's lives, when we're invested in building relationship with Jesus and trying to make the world look more like his kingdom, trying to create an equitable society, to find ways to do that in our everyday lives, that we find that we find ways to employ our gifts. And sometimes it leads us down a path of step-by-step sort of uncovering more and more of what makes us feel most alive and that we're living into that second calling. But usually that can start right exactly where we are. And so it seems like the more of that type of work that we do, the more we find that there is for us to do right in front of us right now. Whether that's employment or job, maybe it's a calling to serving within our family in this particular moment. You're in a season where that's where that takes form. It can be in a corporate job, it can be at a school, it could be working at a church, whatever it is, but we'll figure that out as we go. And so I want us to think about this. This is interesting, and Ashley helped me see this through most of human history. And even today, in most parts of the world, most people don't get a lot of say over or haven't had a lot of say over their jobs, where it is that they work. If you were born a carpenter or a blacksmith or born into that family, that's what you did. You didn't get to pick your job. And in places all across the world right now, because of a lack of access to resources, because of where they're born, because of opportunities, because of their families, people don't get to pick their jobs. Are they called? Yes, we've already said that all followers of Christ, they share that primary calling. It's the same. That's always been true, even if we don't get to pick the secondary. So remember that when we get frustrated trying to figure that secondary piece out, we're still called, and that's critically important. And sometimes when we get impatient because God's call isn't clear, I think it's because we're looking for more specificity than sometimes will exist. Another story, when I was called to seminary, it was very specifically to that word, to go to seminary. I didn't even know what seminary was when that started. And I'm going to try to make a long story short, but as I was trying to pick where to go to seminary, I got so angry with God because it was just unclear. Doors weren't opening like I thought. I expected preferably a handwritten letter by God that said, this is where you're supposed to go to school. That didn't come. And so I was getting frustrated. I was coming down to the wire. I had people looking at me saying, where are you going to go? What's your next step? And I did not know the answer. And then I felt like one evening, God just spoke to me and said, listen, it doesn't matter which one you pick. You're being faithful to the call. You're doing that first step of following after. And whether you pick this school or that one, you're doing what you're called to do. And so it doesn't matter. Sometimes we want a whole lot of specificity. And I think God, in essence, if we're being more brash, doesn't care. Do the thing that God has called you to, and the specifics of it we can work out within our context and within our time. Last thing that I'll say about this is that our calling is going to change over time. It may look like one thing when your family is in one status or sphere of life. It may be caring for aging parents or young children. It may look like starting new in a new place, in a new city, doing a new career. It's going to change over time. This isn't something that we go and uncover, that we turn over the right rocks, that we say the right prayer and calibrate our spiritual antenna to hear God's response, and then we've uncovered it and we get to wear it like a badge and that's it. No, we're going to rediscover and move deeper into it throughout our lives. So know that this is a long, long journey. When we get impatient, I don't know if that helps or hurts, but remember, it's always going to be a journey. So that's how I think we deal with impatience. Let's jump into the second question. How do I avoid comparing my calling to somebody else's, size, scale, etc.? So I thought long and hard about saying, like, just don't do it, but I'm not sure that that's particularly helpful for us. So I want to give perhaps a little bit more context to it. Friends, here's the deal, that I think in all of life, Teddy Roosevelt is right, that comparison is going to be the thief of joy. But truthfully, comparison is going to be the thief of even contentment. Forget about joy, just being content and satisfied with the way things are. We get inundated with comparisons, especially in social media, because we get to see curated versions of people's lives, because we're constantly told that somebody else's job or family or income or vacation or somebody else's body or somebody else was whatever, their church has it all going on and everything's fine. And so we get into this comparison game, and we struggle with it in all sorts of ways. A calling is no different. Sometimes we look at theological giants and we say, oh, they're called. We've been talking a lot over the last month about Martin Luther King Jr., and we can look at him and say, yes, he was called. He knew what he was supposed to do. It's very clear. He's gifted. He made an impact. Of course, he's called. We can also look at people who are in positions of power. Maybe we look at a politician and say, clearly they're called. Or maybe we've never said that about a politician. I don't know. Maybe we look at Patrick Mahomes and we say he has gifts. He was destined for this, to be in the spotlight, to live his best life, to use his gifts, and hopefully to make a positive impact in the world around him off the football field. He has a calling. We look at a pastor. We look at a worship leader. We look at somebody like that and we say they have a calling, but not me. Friends, that's not the case. But all of us are prone to develop these comparisons with everything. Calling is no different. And by the way, it's the same for for the disciples even. So one of my favorite stories happens in John 21, right at the end of the gospel. Peter, if you remember, while Jesus is being crucified, denies 3 times that he even knows Jesus. And then he gets so convicted because Jesus said he was going to do this, and he just goes and weeps. And you can imagine how distraught he is, sort of abandoning Jesus in his last moments. And so then after the resurrection in John's gospel, Jesus sort of reinstates him, is often how we talk about it. And so he says 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And he says, yes. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Yes, feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? And it says that Peter is hurt by the question. He says, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. Then he goes on to say a little bit about what will happen in Peter's future. And he ends by saying, follow me. Okay, Peter, like Peter usually does, just totally blows it. because immediately after he's saying, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, follow me, it says that Peter turns around and looks, and this is John 21:21. He saw another disciple behind him and said, Lord, what about him? And Jesus said to him, I think he grabbed him by the collar and said, are you kidding me? He said, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. Right in that moment, that reinstatement, this holy and sacred moment, Peter, who will be the rock on which Jesus builds the church, immediately, what does he say? Well, what about that person? And Jesus is like, just follow me. We can do this all the time, and nobody is immune to it. So comparison, it's normal, but it isn't always helpful. And so to prevent us from doing that, here's my practical guide to doing that. First of all, I think we need to remember at that foundational level, all of these people, Peter, the disciple, Martin Luther King Jr., the reformer, the pastors that speak to you, the worship leaders that sing and lead us in worship, all of us share the same fundamental calling. You, I, all of us, the same thing, to follow closer to Jesus. And so maybe we just want to remind ourselves when we start to look in other directions, hear the voice of Jesus saying, follow me, follow me. What is it to you? What's going on over there? Follow me. Follow me, and just be reminded of that, to follow Jesus more closely, to remember that we all share that same calling together. Second, I've already said it, I want to say it again, focus on that primary calling. Put your energy and attention right there. Third, and this is true for all comparisons, whether that's materialistic things, body image, our calling, all of it. I think there's a couple of things that we can do. Ask yourself, are you using a realistic measuring stick? If you're looking at Martin Luther King as the image for what it means to be called, like you're always going to feel, I'm always going to feel, we're always going to feel like we don't measure up, because that's a unique person. But maybe you know somebody who goes to church with you, or who's in your community, who's a normal, everyday person who seems to have that figured out. Maybe you want to have conversations with them. Maybe you want to talk through that. Maybe you want to use that as your measuring stick, something that's a little bit more realistic. The second thing, point B of this, is if you're always comparing to an end result or a curated, projected reality, then perhaps you want to think more about what are the steps that cause somebody to get there. And so just to stick with calling specifically, maybe it's about fostering that intentional prayer, having intentional reflection and conversations with people who are further on down the road. Maybe it's about investing in steps in a process to get closer, to lead us in a particular direction. And fourth, finally, I want to say this. I think that you can begin to take stock of the impact that you can have in your world right now. And I think that can do a lot to sort of temper the comparison that will rob us of contentment. And so you can have an impact without giving national speeches, without being a pastor, without being on TV every week. There is a lot of ways we can change the world right around us. Our workplaces, our communities, our schools, people who are struggling within our own friend groups. I often say that I think you people who have normal jobs and work in normal places and interact with normal people who aren't pastors, that you have a better chance to make an impact than sometimes I do. Because you encounter folks who haven't made church a priority, who don't think that God makes a difference in life, or perhaps thinks that God hates them or wants nothing to do with them because they've been told that before. You encounter people who have questions, and you have an opportunity to share of your own faith, maybe by talking about it in that way, or just simply witnessing to the way you deal with difficult things in life, to let people know who are struggling or wandering or wondering, simply that they're loved and they're cared about. You have the opportunity to do that all the time. We can make a huge impact right where we're at, without a clarity of some new stage or new step or moving into something new. We all have the opportunity to make an impact right now. And if we can focus on that instead of comparing to others, it's going to be a huge, huge gift. When I was learning to drive, and my dad was sitting in the seat next to me, he used to always tell me that when I would check my blind spot to turn, to change lanes or turn in one direction, that I would move the wheel of the car without meaning to. That when I turned my head, I would turn the wheel and I would begin to drift. And so he would say, drifting, or come back to this lane, or look ahead. And I used to argue with him. You may be shocked to know that he was right. And I know that he's right because now I don't have my dad riding next to me, but I have these beeps in my car. And when I drift, it beeps. And if I tell them I'm not drifting, they don't care either. So they say it anyway. So I know that we do this. And friends, this is what I think about often happens with comparison. We're looking over there, we're looking over here, and we start drifting one way or another. And it's impossible for us to do the work that God has called us to do when we're always looking and saying, what's she doing over there? What's going on over there? What's happening at that church? Man, that looks really cool. And I just hear Jesus saying, like, follow me. Follow. Look, don't worry about them. Follow me. We drift out of the lanes. We lose track of our own calling when we begin to do that comparison. And I think that each one of us loses opportunities to make an impact in the world around us right now, right here, right where we are, not in some future time when we get lost in that comparison game. I want to end with these words from Hebrews because I think it's so important. Just parts of 2 verses from chapter 12. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Friends, may we learn to stay in our lane, trusting that God has called us. And even when we don't have all of the specifics and we get frustrated about what that looks like, even when we feel tempted to look at what everybody else is doing and compare ourselves to that, may we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the one who says, follow me, the one who began and perfects our faith, and follow the lane that God has set before us to share with others and to change the world around us each and every day. Amen.